Thank you for the very kind introduction, and it's such a privilege to be here, and I'm so excited and thrilled to be able to speak to you about our research on the economics of happiness to you. I've actually prepared quite a bit of material, maybe a little too much, and so if it feels like I'm rushing you through slides and material, it's probably because I am rushing you through lots of material and slides. So my hope is that in the afternoon or over dinner this evening, if you're interested in some aspects of this, that we can get into a bit more discussion and more detailed and go a little bit deeper in some of the relationships, causal or correlational, that I'll be showing to you this afternoon. So on the menu is the following. On the one hand, I'd like to give you a bit of an overview of the state of happiness around the world and link that up with our bigger, well-known measures of GDP and your personal income. I also want to touch on research, what I like to call happiness 2.0 studies that don't just look at what makes people happy, but rather what the positive and objective benefits are of raising well-being. So for the skeptics amongst you, what are the good reasons why you ought to be paying attention to well-being in business and in policy? And then one specific aspect of society where this is needed, and I'll show you some data on the current status of workplace well-being and happiness, is that we really need to focus a bit more on happiness at work. And so I'll show you some data there and some possible interventions. Okay, but first what I want to touch base upon is something that will be very obvious to you, which is that happiness matters. But this hasn't been all that obvious to most policymakers. So very senior policymakers have typically not paid much attention to this and haven't necessarily put the human well-being center stage in policymaking. But, and this is what I'm so excited about, in the last few years, I've literally seen a major shift in the thinking amongst the senior policymakers. This hasn't necessarily cascaded down to policy all that much, but I'm seeing it in action at the highest levels. And I could give you a whole list of interesting quotes that kind of point in that direction, but let me just give you three. The first one is David Cameron, who noted that we need to be looking beyond GDP and looking towards general well-being to complement measures of GDP. Another one for economists, and especially those of you who have studied economics before, Ben Bernanke, in one of his very last policy speeches, noted that the ultimate purpose of economics, of course, is to understand and promote the enhancement of well-being. The of course sounds very wrong to me, because anybody who has studied economics as a background knows that the closest we have in economic theory to well-being is this theoretical conceptual notion of utility, right? And utility in practical terms comes down to consumption. And so that is not the well-being that most people would conceive of. Okay, but it's fantastic news. And more recently, just one example, this year, Sheikh Mohammed of the UAE has made a very bold statement noting that well-being and happiness ought to be the noble goal and supreme objective of the government. And he's very serious about that. So the whole policy manual is being rewritten towards including well-being in, say, cost-benefit analysis and cost-effectiveness. In fact, this is a strong statement, but he's put even a happiness ministry in place that sits on top of all the other ministries. So, and I've had the privilege of working with the new Minister for Happiness over the summer, and she has a very strong mandate, and they're very serious and scientific about the way they approach this. And I'm very pleased to say, and we did push her on that, is that they will think about this as more broader than just the 15% Emiratis living in the UAE. So they do think of this as a mission that is well beyond just their own citizens. So that's very promising indeed. Good. All of this has culminated in a recent UN General Assembly resolution, which was sponsored by Bhutan. Some of you will have heard of Bhutan as a country that has always focused on what they call gross national happiness and has never kind of been willing to measure even GDP. And they sponsored this UN General Assembly resolution, which was unanimously voted in by all member states of the United Nations. And it was noted that we ought to start measuring well-being in addition to other measures as a view to guiding development. That same year, we came out with the first World Happiness Report, which is edited by Lord Layard, Jeffrey Sachs, and John Halliwell, and I've joined them now as an editor from this year onwards. And in that report, we do a ranking, even though we don't like rankings. We do a ranking, and as John Halliwell says, it's just to trap the journalists to actually pay attention, and then we hope that everybody reads the other chapters in the report to actually make good sense of what this all means. But the ranking does seem to get most attention, I have to say, and I can't help but showing some of it in a moment myself. And so let's start with that. And so we kind of fall prey to our own. Anyway, what I'm showing, what I want to start with, kind of a state of world happiness between all nations. And what you're seeing here on the vertical axis is average well-being in a society. How do we measure this, you ask? It's actually a major effort run by the Gallup organization, a polling organization that you may have heard of. And they send expert teams into every single country. Well, not all, but 156 of them, which is still a lot. And they will ask large representative samples of people questions about well-being and happiness, including one question that we, the economists, tend to kind of like most because it gives a nice evaluative overall measure of general well-being. And that is, how satisfied are you with your life on a scale from 1 to 10? I actually have become so accustomed to this question that when people ask me, how are you? I say like 7.5, 8. I find myself doing this more and more, which is pretty bad. But and so maybe you'll start doing the same too. But what you'll notice is there's no country that scores below 3 out of 10 on average life satisfaction for its population. Which, to be honest, is very poor. So the countries we're talking about here are Benin, Togo, these kind of very poor countries indeed. The happiest countries, no country scores above 8 out of 10 on this measure of average life satisfaction in a society. And then I've mapped it such that the bigger countries in terms of population stand out a bit more. So you obviously recognize China, India, and the United States of America. Okay, this is a beautiful little picture, at least in my mind, but it tells a complex story. And let me run you through a few elements of this. The first one is development. Anybody telling you that economic development has no impact on well-being is telling rubbish. Because there's a very clear trend between economic development and rising of well-being. There's no question that for a number of countries to be able to rise and develop economically will likely benefit their well-being. However, you'll probably also agree with me that for the developed nations, the relationship is much less clear, right? So look at the countries above 20,000 GDP per capita, and the relationship is pretty much insignificant. There's none, it's a straight line, right? And this also gets backed up by more sophisticated analysis that I can delve into. So this raises a number of questions, and we'll get to those in a moment, and we'll delve a little bit deeper. But you'll obviously be interested, as we all tend to be, in rankings, and so you're obviously thinking, who are the countries all the way on top? And then you're probably hoping, where's Norway in all of this? And so these, I put the top countries on there, and what you'll, I looked into the Norwegian statistics a little bit more detail, and so Norway actually this past year in the World Happiness Report came in 4th, with an average response to the life satisfaction question of 7.48, which is slightly lower than the year before when it came in at 7.52. And so I don't know what's going on in this country, but John mentioned the falling oil price having impact, and so it could be interesting to study this in a bit more detail. But rest assured that between 7.48 and 7.52, you're amongst a very elite club, if you will, of nations that have high life satisfaction. So you should consider yourself very privileged. Now you're probably wondering who's numbers 1 and 2 and 3, and so Denmark, Switzerland, and Iceland are just above you, and Denmark and Switzerland are typically 1 and 2. Okay, now we're so focused on these top countries that we tend to forget about the negative aspect. And when I was introduced, I was told that I would like to generate more happiness, but I do recall sending along that I also like to reduce misery. And so when my mentor, Lord Richard Layard, talks about this, he will always insist that it's not just about raising happiness, but very much about reducing misery in the world. And I'm going to give you 2 instances throughout the presentation where you'll find that when we talk about putting well-being center stage, it's not just about making people happy, smiley, go lucky. It's really, if you're serious about this, it often focuses in more on the people who are at the bottom end. The people going through recessions, people with mental health issues, who are at the 1s or the 2s out of 10, right? So these are the people we'll be focusing on. And I just want to mention one here, Greece. You'll all be familiar with the fact that Greece has gone through a tough time. Greece has dropped between 20 and 25% of its GDP since the financial crisis. But what has happened to its well-being is even worse. So its well-being has dropped below any historical record for well-being in Greece, and we have records going back to the 70s and early 80s, right? So what you're seeing here is, and this is what we studied, is how does growth and recessions, positive and negative economic growth, how does it correlate with well-being? And what we found is that a drop in well-being, we're twice as sensitive to. So we will respond, our well-being will respond twice as much to, say, a drop of 1% in our growth as compared to an increase of 1%, right? Some of you will be familiar with the behavioral economics talk of loss aversion. So we were the first ones to show this on a macro level using these well-being data. So when the Financial Times wrote about this research, and they looked at Greece in particular, they said, this is actually the untold story of the recession in Greece. Because we talk about the economic damage, but the psychological well-being, that damage is even larger, right? So it's twice as large as we would have gained in equivalent gains from growth. Okay, and by the way, this also, because I'm here in Norway, and I like to make this point, some of you will be wondering, okay, say, take Denmark, and Norway is very wealthy, but take Denmark and Sweden versus the USA. They're pretty much as rich on a GDP per capita basis, yet you, the Scandinavian welfare states, do slightly better, actually quite a bit better, half a point or more on average in terms of well-being, which is a lot. One of the reasons why this is the case, I would argue, stems from our research on Greece and falling GDP, is that the Norwegian welfare state, as do the other Scandinavian countries, put these safety nets in place. So these losses that are so impactful on people's well-being are actually kind of stopped much more than into more liberal market economies is the case. And so that psychological security of these, the negative impact of these drops in growth that we will have throughout a business cycle, at least 1 or 2 years will be less, well, that is dampened. You guys put buffers in place that are not in place in liberal market economies. So what I'm saying here is that from a well-being perspective, you can build a very strong and new case for the welfare state above and beyond redistribution and fairness. Okay. So that's that. So this is the first thing I want to mention of just not just looking at the positives, but well-being is all the more needed in negative cases. Over time, how have we been doing? Because what I just showed you is a cross-sectional between nations. But over time, we've got some pretty amazing data, thanks to the Eurobarometer, for the European nations. This doesn't include Norway, but is about 15 EU member states that have been around for a while. And the scale here is, again, life satisfaction on a scale from 1 to 4. And there's been movement, but we've been kind of stuck around this 3 out of 4 for quite a while, right? And this is especially surprising because if we put GDP on top of this, adjusted for inflation, we've done extremely well in terms of GDP. But our well-being has been hovering around that level of 3. Okay, so a lot can be said about this, but one thing is really darn sure is that the welfare of a nation, as construed as well-being, can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income. Now, this is said by Simon Kuznets a while back. Who is Simon? Anybody who knows who Simon Kuznets is or has heard of the person? Okay. Simon Kuznets, I figured few, but maybe there was 1 or 2 who had really delved in their economic history books. Simon Kuznets is a Nobel laureate, is the one who invented national income accounts and GDP thus. And this is a piece out of his speech before US Congress, where he explains to the congressman in the US how his national income accounts work. So let me get this very straight to you. So the person who invented the notion of GDP actually told us, please do not use this measure as a measure of social progress and welfare of our nation, just as a measure of consumption and expenditure and that kind of stuff. And so what have we done, needless to say? What gets measured gets done, and we've kind of run away with this notion of GDP as the one yardstick that all these countries, developed and developing, need to be measured against. So I really want to point this out, that we have obviously been very much focused on this, and we shouldn't perhaps have. And this is also the reason why I think in the developed nations, some of this political shift that you're seeing when I show you Bernanke and Cameron and even Sheikh Mohammed, people who they're probably seeing this or feeling this somehow, that their societies aren't getting any happier, and there is losses in well-being, and there's inequalities in well-being as there are in economic inequalities, and that they want to that they feel that that this focus on growth in GDP is not necessarily translating in a happier society. So they're starting to become a bit, they're looking for alternatives, I think, and that's where this shifting mindset amongst developed economies leaders is coming from this insight. Okay, shifting from the macro to the micro, this is, I'm not sure whether you can read these specifics, but this is the latest UK data on people's income by kind of categories of jobs. So I'll help you here in case you can't see it. The richest people in reported income are chief executives, and they make about £120,000 on average a year. The poorest people, and unhappy at the same time, are people in call centers, people operating the telephones. There's two exceptions that seem to be striking outside of anything else, which is on the one hand the clergy, priests, and politicians. And I've heard one skeptic person saying that they get paid in different ways. And that hence the translation to well-being being high somehow. But I'm just a scientist. We'll just take the data and we'll see what we do, and we'll take account of these outliers, and we'll not try and find silly excuses for them. But I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you can see the exact same pattern appearing at the micro, at the individual level on income, as you saw with the macro level that I showed you earlier. There's this diminishing marginal returns to further income, something that you've probably already heard about or felt, but it's amazing to really kind of see it in the data, I think. Okay, now I want you to pause for a moment, and I want you to feel or think about whether or not there's something deeply flawed with this picture I'm showing you, and it is the following. Our society has always kind of conditioned us to look at this question of the relationship between income and happiness in one direction, right? So I've been explaining it to you as if GDP or income, does it buy you happiness to some extent? And then the diminishing margin returns to it. But in my methodological classes, I learned that we always need to be careful about reverse causality, the chicken and the egg problem. And yet somehow we don't consider this in this question. So for example, happier individuals may be making more money later on. So I'm not sure if you follow me fully. It could well be that the relationship we're seeing amongst, say, chief executives being happier, that it's not due to higher earnings, it's because they were happier before they were making money, right? So there's a methodological issue of reverse causality, the chicken and the egg problem. So we set out to actually study this, and my colleague Andrew Oswald and I then found some interesting stuff that got a lot of press attention, and we published it in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a very good journal, I like to think. No, it is. I'm just throwing it out here for science people because it's the third highest impact factor academic journal, so I thought I'd give myself some credibility in presenting this. Silly. So the point I'm trying to make here is the following. We delved into this, and what we worked at is on a huge American sample of 15,000 Americans who have been tracked over time, right? A panel study, as we call it. And we have data about their positive affect, their happiness at 16, happiness at 18, their life satisfaction 22, and we have their earnings at the age of 29, 30, which when there's first good earnings data. So these people have been followed over time. And what we did, Andrew and I, is to look at, are their levels of happiness at these early ages predictive of how well they do in terms of earnings 10 years later? And what you're finding is that in our sample, the average earnings was about $34,600 in the sample of 15,000 people. And what we found is that the people who were happy at 16, at 18, at 22, all these differences in their happiness back in those days was actually predictive of later earnings. So the chicken and egg problem that is potentially present in this relationship is very much a problem for the standard money buys you happiness argument. So in fact, even if there's a bit of a relationship between money buying you happiness, it's very much undermined by the fact that richer people were happier before, right? Okay. Here is two quick notes. One is on the negative front, the people that are unhappy. So the happier individuals make on average about $3,000 more. So happier kids score about make about or earned about $3,000 more at the end when they were about 30. But look at the unhappy children. The unhappy adolescents, they're about $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 below the average. So again, when the media picked up on this, and the LA Times and the Guardian and New York Times, they were all talking about happier kids make more money. But really the story is unhappy kids make much less, right? And so again, if you were to put well-being more central in policymaking, you would quickly find out that the data is pushing you towards working on the low end of the scale and trying to help the people who are worse off, like reduce the misery, not just raise happiness by focusing on the bottom end. Okay, only 3 minutes left. Oh boy. I only have 20 slides left. So but I want to point something out, and this is obviously for the academic geeks amongst you. Some of you may be thinking, but wait a second. Could it not be that happier individuals or adolescents have grown up in wealthier backgrounds, and that is really driving the fact that they're doing better later on through socioeconomic status? But, and this is why I got published in a good journal, is in the data there were many brothers and sisters, sibling clusters. And so what we did is we looked into these families, and we actually went in there and we looked at the differences between the brothers and the sisters. So if you and I were siblings, I'd look at the differentials at these ages in our happiness and look at how the differences in happiness are explanatory or predictive of the differences in our earnings, thereby taking out the socioeconomic status effects of our family, right? And here too, the results came out very strongly, and this is why we think we're onto something big. Now, if you have kids or you're thinking of having kids, do not share this research with them because they will come after you and ask for euphoria, not just happiness. I want to move. You will have seen I've moved away from just what drives happiness to what are the benefits, the impact of, or the effects of raising happiness. And so I've just shown you the one paper with Andrew on the impact on later income or later earnings, but that's just one. There's really good research on the impact of raising well-being on health and even longevity, which could have major savings in the National Health Services, for example, right? Pro-social behavior. My colleagues, Mike Norton at Harvard Business School, shows that happy individuals become more pro-social, which gets picked up in volunteering. So they're more likely to volunteer, which in turn helps their happiness, right? And then we have a really cool little study, I think, that also shows a causal impact on people's risk behavior. So for example, we found this to be the case with people wearing their seatbelts and getting involved in motor vehicle accidents. Happier individuals are more likely to wear their seatbelts because they care more about their own lives, to put a greater value on it from an economic perspective. No, it's cynical, isn't it? But we have this theoretical model in there that says, like, if you have higher life satisfaction, it means you value your life more, so you'll take more care of it, which kind of makes sense, and we see it in this kind of behavior. Now, finally, my colleague Andrew Roosevelt, with whom I've worked, has a paper, and this is what I'm really excited about because it gets us to well-being in the workplace, is you always talk, there's lots of talk about happiness and productivity, but this 2015 study in the Journal of Labor Economics is the first that I know is a causal estimate of, in the lab, being able to manipulate treatment and control groups and their happiness and has them go through and run through specific tasks, productivity and memory tasks. What they find is that there's a strong and significant 7 to 12% increase in people's well-being, productivity following well-being. And this is important, and I'll end on this, is because the current state of well-being in the workplace is extremely low. My colleagues at the LSE, Alex and George, have this app called Mappenis, and it pings people a few times a day, and hundreds of thousands of Brits are actually on it, and it asks them the question, the people who are pinged, how happy are you now, and what are you doing? And there's 39 activities that are possible. It could be, I'm driving to work, or I'm at work, I'm sleeping, I'm watching telly, whatever. And what they found is that being at work is the second lowest correlation with happiness, and the worst one is being sick in bed. So it's pretty bad. And Gallup showed that this is the case for across the world and not just the UK. Should I? Excellent. Okay, thank you. So I'm really excited then to be able to show you the other few slides. But this feels a bit like a royal pardon. And so so I'll go quick, but it's interesting, I promise you, and important. Because I know most of you are working in the private sector and businesses are setting up your own business. And so well-being in the workplace is very low. We've got only 13% of employees worldwide that are actually fully engaged with their work. So there's room for improvement. And as I said, there's big productivity gains, and other interesting research showing that job satisfaction reports are actually predictive of your bottom line, and more so than in the opposite case. Okay, now there's one thing that I want to mention here, is that if you go back to your team senior managers and you say, okay, this guy from Oxford started talking about causal effects of happiness and productivity, we need to do more, how about these and these interventions? Your boss is going to come back to you and say, like, okay, but how much does this cost me? Right? And that is not something my colleague Andrew Oswald accounted for, obviously, in these studies. He just shows the effect of happiness and productivity. But business leaders are also concerned about how much does it cost. But I know of one study, my colleague Alex Edmonds at London Business School, and I've had long discussions about him with this, published in a very good journal, and what he did is to figure this out, is to look at the overall performance of a firm, which takes into account both the costs and the benefits, needless to say, on the stock market. And the way he did it, and I find it super fascinating, I hope you do too, he went back to the 80s when the first lists of, in the US context, the best places to work for, some of you may be familiar with this, I think it's a Bloomberg report, comes out every year, and lists 100 best places to work for in the United States. Well, he went back and said, like, had you invested on these companies just on the basis of good places to work for, what would have been the return, right, over the years if you were an investor and had put your money in these stocks? What we found is that over time, you would have a cumulative annual return of over 2% above the benchmark indices that these, like the S&P 500 and others, right? So this accounts for both the productivity gains from being a good place to work for, as well as the cost of actually making this happen. So this is big. The reasons being, easier to recruit people if you're a happy workplace, easier to motivate them and make them more productive, and especially important for business leaders, how can you retain your best people, right? And so happier individuals in the workplace are obviously more likely to be retained. I know of one, I actually looked into this and I spoke with Alex, I know of one fund that actually does this and focuses in, invests a mutual fund in the US that we as Europeans can't invest in, so there's no point even going for it, but invests in positive and innovative workplaces, and they've done exceptionally well. Over the past 15 years. 10 years. Okay, quick roundup of kind of the typical interventions that people tend to do. You'll be familiar with the what can we do about raising well-being in the context of business. One is these more fluffy, if you will, interventions around flexi time and meditation, yoga, sports classes, and really emphasizing positive contributions. But I like the more structural interventions, such as paying employees in a different way. So my colleagues, Andrew Clark et al., what they showed is that it's not just about how much you pay employees, but also about how you pay employees, right? And so they looked at lots and lots of data of salaries and correlated job satisfaction, control for the same set of salaries, but looked at the way these were paid. What they found is that if you're paid, your ultimate outcome is the same as somebody who's just a regular salary, but part of this is through, say, profit sharing, stock options, or group bonuses and share purchase plans to try and engage the individual, the employee, more and align them more with the incentives of the company, feel them more engaged and own parts or a little piece of the company. They found there was actually a significant, statistically significant increase in average well-being because of it. So these kind of structural ways of intervening in companies are interesting. Some of you may be familiar with some of these companies like Zappos in the US and Gore-Tex or Semco in Brazil and Coronaflex in France. They have more participative workplaces, again, to try and engage people in a different way that is conducive to higher well-being. And then finally, you may also be familiar with the fact that there's more technology going around that allows managers to actually really kind of track well-being in a non-intrusive, nicer way in the workplace. Because what we have to work with as scientists from the companies out is real rubbish. There's like 1 or 2 surveys a year about how people feel and their job satisfaction in the job. Like some of you working in firms will know you'll get this once a year. It's like some silly big survey. And then you know what? HR managers, they throw it out at the end of the year. So we researchers don't even get to work with it over time. 1, and 2, they change the questions every year. And so you can't even correlate them over time. So it's a total mess from that perspective. And so, but I think tech allows you to do this much in a more interesting way. Not just the measurement, but also the engagement. So this particular tool called Butterfly, which is a New York startup, also not just measures this, but also kind of allows managers and people to engage in a more kind of survey feedback way, and also anonymous if they want to. If people want to give feedback about certain things, but wouldn't because obviously it's difficult with your line manager, there's new tools available to allow for more engagement. Okay, let me conclude on simply saying that for the cynics or the skeptics amongst you, there's so many objective benefits to putting subjective well-being center stage that it's really a case that is now scientifically made, and that I'm so eager and so pleased to see that businesses and policymakers are starting to take into account as well. So on that note, thank you very much.